let's talk about ironing your fabric. Make sure it's not has a lot of steam. This is my favorite iron, by the way. I want to talk to you about ironing your fabric and why it's important to do it. One of the things I wanted to share with you about being more accurate in your piecing is iron your fabric before you even cut it. I know I hate ironing. As a matter of fact, I pull my clothes out of the dryer right when it turns off because I refuse to iron my clothes if I don't have to. So I kind of took that into my piecing, quilt making process. I did not like ironing. As a matter of fact, I would get a piece of fabric, I would rub it on the mat and push it down as much as I could, put the ruler on top of it and cut it with a rotary cutter. And sometimes a straight line would look like, well, like a hill as I would cut it. And a lot of it is because unknowingly I had a pleat somewhere in the fabric because I didn't iron, or a real weird ripple, and so it hindered the accuracy of my cutting. When you're piecing or when you're getting ready to cut your fabric, go ahead and use a lot of steam. You know, it's just really preference, but that's how I like it. And I like using a spray starch to get rid of any folds, any wrinkles, especially on those fat quarters that I just bought. You know how they fold them real pretty? You want to get rid of all the folds and have your fabric as straight as possible, so when you get to cutting, you have some success. Here you can see that I have my fabric and I'm trying to get rid of all those folds. Try to iron with steam and some starch to remove the folds, and the reason is, I'm going to show you a cut in a minute. What happens is when you don't iron out your folds, sometimes this is what happens. Where the fold is, I don't know if you can see it, there's like this little molehill where it curves up a little bit because of the fold. So try as much as you possibly can to iron all your fabric. Here I'm showing you fabric that has pleats within it, and if you don't iron those pleats, you'll have them in your cuts. It is extremely tempting to not get up and iron, you know, the little section that you put together, especially when you have like a 9-patch and you have a 3-row put together and you have your other 3 rows put together and your last 3 rows, and you're kind of excited because you're right at the end and you just don't want to get up and iron it because it's like, nah. You just don't want to iron it. Well, what I wanted to share with you is make sure you'll have more success in connecting those little important areas if your fabric is ironed. So, this is what I was talking about. That is very tempting to not go to the iron and iron these pieces together. And a lot of times you don't have to if you're a decent piecer. I used to not do it because I hate it. But now I do it because I find that connecting the seams, it's a lot easier. I wanted to show a demonstration that sometimes when you're trying to set it up on the machine while you're fiddling with it, you may go off a little bit. And also when it's not ironed, it's just harder to get a consistent seam line. What your piece of fabric looks like when you don't iron it. Yeah, it's a little fluffy. It's not sitting well, and you have pieces going multi-directional right there. I am really big about having your blocks nice and ironed and flat. The flatter they are, they're better to store. I also noticed that the steam from the heat pressing makes the fabric kind of a little bit more tighter, and so they kind of stay in position better. So here I'm going to go ahead and finger press the seam out and just kind of hold my fabric and just kind of pull a little bit. I'm not pulling much, and just let. Now I know someone's probably going to get upset because I said pull. I'm not saying to pull it, because especially if it's on the bias, but just hold it nice and taut so when the iron comes to this area of the seam, it pulls all the fabric out away from the seam. Alright, another thing I recommend, and we're talking about ironing, you know, we're talking about ironing. Every time you sew 2 seams together, I remember a teacher used to say to me, turn your fabric to where you see the thread line and set the seam. And what they're really trying to say is when you iron that area where the fabric and the thread connect, when heat gets to it, remember, fabric contracts and expands. That's why when you wear a cool pair of blue jeans, you put them on, they're real tight. You have to lay down and kind of pull them up, and you button them, and they're tight. But by the end of the day, well, they're just right. They're looser, they're more comfortable, and sometimes you wear them for like another day because, you know, as you go, the fabric stretches. All fabric does that. It expands and contracts. And one of the reasons why it gets so tight, I'm sure you all know, when it is in the dryer, heat and water, of course, is wet because it's been washed, and the heat of the dryer contract that thread fiber together and they tighten it. So one of the reasons they say set the seam is you're kind of getting the fiber of the fabric and the seam fiber, and they're tightening together. They're kind of molded together, and that's why they say set the seam. And I'm setting the seam on a very long piece, and ignore the waviness, okay? Also, how you iron matters. My way of ironing, I do not open my seams. I wanted to do a video on that. Open seam, closed seam, I don't know. I'll do a video on it, but I always have my seams closed. That's my preference, and I'm going to tell you why. As a long armor, and I know there's probably been, I've heard some conversations about this, that if you have an open seam and you lower your stitch length, you're less likely to have your seam open. Well, yeah, that is true. But what I have found as a long arm quilter, that if there is an open seam and the long arm needle goes right in between those two seams, it's more likely to pierce the thread that put the seam together. It kind of cuts it, and then the seam pops open. All right, that's my opinion as a long arm quilter. But it does happen to me, and I don't know if the reason is because their stitch length is too long. So, my opinion, it's only my opinion, I recommend that you always put your seam or iron your seam to the darkest side of the fabric. So what I do is I go ahead and I lay this down, and I make sure these two outer pieces go out, and I iron this down. And remember, we always want to go towards the dark. Well, Lorena, the truth is there's always going to be some seams towards the light. So this is folded towards the light, just right here. Now, I tend to have a rule of thumb where I have the most dark, I press it in. This doesn't have as much dark, so it's not going to affect the fabric as much. When you put the fabric towards the dark or towards the light, do you see how you can see that seam right there? I've noticed sometimes when piecers have not set their fabric towards the dark, especially red fabric with white fabric, you end up having the red bleed into the white, especially when you spray water or starch or something. The red fabric that's underneath, tucked in here, like right here where you see the dark right there, it will bleed to the top. So my recommendation is, as much as you possibly can, move your fabric towards the dark. And I know sometimes your seams aren't going to connect the way they should. I have a trick for that. You can literally nip right there, and you can nip here. So the fabric is going towards the dark, like right there, folding over, and this can go You can also do this trick when you have tons of seams and you have a lot of bulkage, and you can nip those areas to where the fabric fits. Now, I'm not going to worry about it, especially with blues and other colors, but when you're doing a quilt that has a lot of red, when you place water in it, if you did not wash it and make sure that you got all the bleeding out from the red, it does bleed through. I've seen it on a couple quilts. So my recommendation is you can nip it, and you can literally see. You don't see the seam anymore. in any way. I hope you could see that. As we're talking about ironing, I know a lot of stuff about stupid ironing. I've found that a lot of people lose 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch because of how they iron. And if you lose 1/16 of an inch, I know it's a tiny, tiny bit. As the quilt is, and you keep losing 1/16 of an inch, it kind of adds up. I know a friend of mine, she literally lost about 2 inches on her quilt. I know, it was a big quilt. But what I found is that she ironed her fabric from the back. She ironed it from the back. And she set the seam to one side. And what ended up happening is there was almost as if the fabric went in a little bit. And because she didn't flip her fabric over and iron and pull it open and make sure that the seam was real straight and clean, that she kind of lost in some areas a 1/16 of an inch. I know you're like, what the hell, who cares about that? So if you iron from one side, you can have a little tiny fold or pleat or fold over. I'll show you. And you can lose some of your fabric that way. It's not very significant, but it can be if you have a big quilt. And I had a friend, she didn't understand why she lost 2 inches on her quilt when she was trying to be as accurate as she could be. But when she did those long seams and she folded the seam over, she only did it on the back side. She didn't fold her quilt top over and made sure that the fabric was pulled out. And I'll explain in a minute, okay? On this end, what I found, a lot of people just get their fabric and they open it, right? Just like that. And I don't know if you can see some of this buckling. They get their seam and then they start just pulling it, just like that. How a lot of people iron this way. And they think that they have ironed everything and it looks nice and clean. They don't go back and iron from the top. I hope you can see how much fabric I can pull out of that seam. Do you see this? I have seen more quilts that I go ahead and iron for clients that they have this. And then they wonder why in one area, the bottom or the top of the quilt or the left side or the right side, why they have lost some inches, why their quilt is not square, and a lot of it is because of how they ironed. Here you can see this amount of fabric. What I tend to do is I get the fabric and I open it, and I want the fabric to go towards the dark. And what I do is I open it and I start finger pressing it at the seam. And I'll do that here. All right, another thing I wanted to talk about is when you are ironing, when you are ironing, make sure your back seam is all in one direction. I've noticed, because I was a lazy ironer, that a lot of times I did not care if the seam in the back went one direction and then it kind of flipped over to the other direction. I didn't care. I didn't regard it. But it makes this weird lump, and you'll see it in the seam and when I show it to you in a minute. And I also recommend this if you ever want your quilts to be stitched in the ditch, or if you want to quilt them in the ditch. If you make sure that your seams are completely one-sided and that there's no rollovers, fabric that rolls over, then you will have better success with stitching in the ditch, because your ruler and your foot sits perfectly on the side. But if there's like a weird flip, it rolled over on you, the machine or the long arm or your sewing machine kind of wants to, when you're sewing in the ditch, because of the seam not being ironed well. Kinda. Okay? I hope I explained that right. And they have this in the back of the seam. This weird in and out. And it's not that big of a deal, but if you want to stitch in the ditch, this will affect your stitching in the ditch. And I don't know if you see it, it has this weird rippling. Ripples here, comes out in a ripple here. It's ironed in one direction. I really do hope you like this video. Coming up, I want the world to know that I'm gonna show. I'm coming. I'm coming.